It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
On the evening of October the 22nd, 1962, American President John F. Kennedy announced the Soviet Union was building missile bases on Cuba, just 90 miles from mainland America.
We are calling tonight for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba under the supervision of UN observers.
In a televised address to the American people, he warned these sites must be dismantled, the missiles removed, or America would take steps to defend herself.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
In 40 years of Cold War, the world never came closer to nuclear holocaust than in the week that followed. In the West, many people still remember the tension they felt then. But what's less well known is how people felt in the East, living in a closed society, the media tightly controlled by the Soviet system. Did ordinary Soviet citizens know how close the world was to war? This program tells the story of that week through the eyes of Alexander and Oksana Gorbovsky, a Russian couple living now in London. Their memories, some typical, some untypical, provide a snapshot of Soviet life at this critical point in the Cold War.
At that time, I was 32 years old. I was a scientist, a researcher in the Academy of Sciences. My wife was a journalist. We had been married just 3 years. We had a little girl, Katya, and we felt all life was in front of us. We were full of plans.
The Gorbovskys lived in a single room in a tenement block on the outskirts of Moscow. They shared communal kitchens with other families in the block. Luxuries were few, but life behind the Iron Curtain wasn't all doom and gloom, as was imagined by many in the West. Rather, Alexander remembers the good things, the benefits of living in a communist state.
We had free medicine, we had free studies, and everything what we had, we believed was given to us by the Soviet system. We were told, when your time comes, you will be given a flat. There is a queue, but when your time comes, you will have it free. And it was true. Maybe it was because I was young then, I don't know, but I remember them as sunny days, sunny years.
In Soviet Russia, the first news of the Cuban crisis appeared in Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, on October the 24th, 2 days after Kennedy's speech to the West. The article described how Kennedy had ordered a blockade of Cuba, 180 US Navy vessels surrounding the island. It described the plucky Cuban people watching the skies, digging in against American attack. With no mention of Soviet missiles spotted on the island, the article seemed confusing.
But I don't understand why. just says President Kennedy tries to justify his aggressive action by talking of an alleged threat to American national security from Cuba. Cuba's so tiny.
It's a fly on America's nose. What threat can he mean?
It doesn't say. Peace-loving states cannot fail to protest against Kennedy, this pirate who thinks international law does not apply to the USA, blah, blah. But people of all countries should understand, behaving so irresponsibly, the USA takes a step along the route to unleashing a world thermonuclear war.
It's just the usual.
This time it sounds more serious.
It wasn't unusual to be confused reading Pravda. Everyone knew the state press was heavily censored. Only news that reflected well on the Soviet system was included, and because that was the way it had always been, no one really questioned it. As Alexander explains, the art with Pravda was to read between the lines.
It was normal. You looked for clues in what was said and what was left unsaid. You asked yourself, is the language stronger than usual? In this case, yes, it was stronger. It was obvious to us straight away. Something was happening, and it had to do with Cuba and American aggression against Cuba.
If Pravda was right, if America was threatening Cuba, it begged the question, why? For most Soviets, it wasn't such a hard question to answer. Cuba was an island of special significance to the Soviet people. 4 years earlier, in January '59, Fidel Castro had swept into Havana, Cuba's capital, the leader of the first communist revolution in the Western Hemisphere. These were electrifying scenes for most ordinary Soviets. Newsreels of Castro's struggle echoed images of Russia's own Bolshevik revolution of 1917. But if Castro was a hero to the Soviets, to the Americans he was quite the opposite.
Says Castro, the Cuban revolutionary government has no reason to offer explanations to America or to anyone except the people of Cuba.
In 1961, Kennedy had allowed the CIA to organize a ragtag army of Cuban right-wingers in an attempt to overthrow Castro. It was an embarrassing failure. Soviet propaganda showed capitalist America huffing and puffing with anger, desperate to remove this pocket of communism in their own backyard. If Pravda now spoke of further American aggression against Cuba, it seemed to make perfect sense.
You must understand our feelings for Cuba. It was like they were our brothers. I remember when Fidel Castro came to Moscow, I saw Khrushchev and Castro standing in the car, driving through the streets, and we were waving, greeting them, and it felt almost personal. They were so close. The distance between me and them was no greater than me to you. They were our brothers. And so we thought, after that fiasco the year before, the Americans are just trying to find a new reason for occupation, invasion, whatever.
But this picture of Cuba and the Soviet Union standing side by side against American aggression tells only half the story. What then was the story from America's point of view? Over 3 years, they'd watched the friendship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. how trade deals had led to arms deals. If Khrushchev supplied Castro with defensive weapons, guns, tanks, that was none of America's business. But what if, in return, Castro let Khrushchev use Cuba as a strategic base for offensive weapons to attack the USA? The CIA was ordered to keep an eye on the island. And on October the 14th, 1962, spy planes confirmed America's fears. The photographs showed missile transporters, fuel trucks, radar vans, nuclear warhead bunkers under construction. And intelligence reports informed Kennedy that at that very moment, more nuclear hardware was on its way. For 5 days, Kennedy had held talks with his National Security Council, reviewing the options, planning a response. The blockade was launched to intercept the arrival of any more missiles and to force Khrushchev to a public resolution of the crisis. These were the facts Pravda had hoped to hide from the Soviet people. But for some Russians, Alexander and Oksana included, there were other ways to find out the truth.
We used to listen to Western radio. It was not usual, but it was not forbidden. I had learned English at school. It was part of my work. And so, unlike most people, we could listen to Voice of America. It was a window into the outside world.
This sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil, in violation of Soviet assurances, is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country.
And what we heard, of course, was quite different to what we had read already in the Russian press.
The Gorbovskis listened as the Americans took their case to the world.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Well, there was a contradiction. All the Russian newspapers and radio and TV and Khrushchev himself has stressed there are no missiles, and the West insists there are missiles. You see? So, who are we to believe? Our Khrushchev or these imperialists? It was not something we like to think that our leaders would lie to us. Best, we thought, to avoid the question, not to ask who is right, who is wrong.
Who was right? Who was wrong? Clearly, Khrushchev had lied about the missiles on Cuba. But whether it was wrong to sight missiles on Cuba at all depends again on your point of view. After all, the Americans had missile bases in Turkey, just 8 minutes firing time from Moscow. Five months earlier, Khrushchev had been walking on the Black Sea coast, across the water from Turkey. As his speechwriter later remembered,
it was pointed out to him that American bases able to wipe out Kiev, Minsk, Moscow were located just on the opposite shore. Khrushchev turned and asked, "So why cannot we have bases close to America? What is the reason for this inequality?"
You see, we were sure that it was only the Americans or American imperialists who were threatening the world. All of us believed this. I remember one moment as a student at that time, this must have been 59, a girl student in my group. It was a sunny spring. She was just sitting at the window looking over the woods and trees. She said, "Such nice weather. It is a pity the Americans are going to bombard us with their atomic bombs." Just a general comment.
Mutual fear had started the Cold War and kept it going. In October 1962, that mutual fear brought the world to the brink of war. Listening on the radio, the Grabowskis pieced together the details of that anxious week. How in Europe, American bombers were flying 24-hour missions, ready for the call to strike. How in Florida, the nearest mainland to Cuba, the biggest American invasion force since the Second World War had assembled. But it was the blockade which focused fear the most. The seemingly inevitable confrontation between the American Navy and Soviet ships carrying military cargoes. If Khrushchev refused to turn the ships around, the result would be catastrophic.
I have taken the necessary steps to deploy our forces to be in a position to make effective the quarantine.
What news?
The forces under my command, that is to say under the command of the President, are ordered to interdict.
I don't know. There are submarines, our submarines, and ships getting closer to the blockade lines. Khrushchev says if they stop the subs will fire. He says we don't want a war, but if Kennedy starts a war, we'll all meet in hell. I wish we really knew what was going on. I have this feeling when we do understand, it'll be too late.
At the White House, the hours ticked away. Kennedy's speech had put the ball in Khrushchev's court. There was little they could do but wait. But Khrushchev, too, was playing a waiting game. On Thursday, October the 25th, the first encounter took place. A US Navy warship intercepted the Soviet tanker Bucharest. With no military cargo on board, she was allowed to proceed. On Friday the 26th, another encounter. A Lebanese vessel, the Marukla, again stopped and searched. But the ships Khrushchev had ordered not to stop were still on their way. To America, it seemed only Khrushchev could now defuse the crisis. On Saturday the 27th, Pravda carried an article from its observer in New York describing the tension there. Panic buying had begun. The fear of nuclear war was almost tangible.
The Americans buy newspapers like mad and read the latest news immediately. They listen to the radio. They stick to their TV screens. Parents want to take their children out of the city. What is going to happen? That's the question on everybody's mouths.
In the East, newsreels later showed passionate scenes of public support for Cuba. But the reality in the streets of Moscow was different, almost calm. Why? Because being told this was a crisis over Cuba, not about Soviet missiles on Cuba, ordinary Russians had less reason to feel frightened. Alexander, who knew so much more than most, remembers the unreal mood.
It was strange. At the academy, You know, this man is having a baby, that man is expecting a promotion, his car must be repaired, just life, you know, going on. I talked with some people, we had a smoking room, we went and talked. They said, they remember the last war. They said, we will survive, you will be interpreter, you will be all right. Not thinking what kind of war this will be. At home, though, with my wife, it was different.
I'll get tickets tomorrow, before the panic strikes.
Where to?
Kiev? You could stay with my aunt.
Not Kiev. Kiev's the first to be hit.
South, then. To Abkhazia. 2 tickets. For you and Katya.
What about you?
If there's a war, I'll be called up. I have to stay.
On the 27th of October, 5 days after Kennedy's speech, Khrushchev offered a deal. Telegrams were received at the White House. If the Americans scrapped the missile bases in Turkey, the Soviets would in turn withdraw from Cuba. Kennedy agreed to Khrushchev's terms, but he kept the Turkish deal a secret from the American people. Later, his advisors liked to boast how they'd stood eyeball to eyeball with Khrushchev, and how Khrushchev had blinked first. Whatever the truth, the crisis was over. On Sunday, the 28th of October, Radio Moscow announced that what America called the offensive missiles on Cuba would be withdrawn. The missiles Khrushchev had always denied existed. In the strange, topsy-turvy world of the Soviet Union, people stopped and puzzled for a moment. But that was all.
To discuss it was to blame Khrushchev, and we didn't want to do that. We were too much in favor of what he has done for us. He was our reality, Khrushchev. We had no choice of any other reality. The feeling was, now it's over, thank God. Let us just get on with living, continue with our everyday lives.